We continue the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James. We continue and possibly conclude lectures 14 and 15, the value of saintliness. We find, accordingly, that as ascetic saints have grown older and directors of conscience more experienced, they usually have shown a tendency to lay less stress on special bodily mortifications. Catholic teachers have always professed the rule that since health is needed for efficiency in God's service, health must not be sacrificed to mortification. The general optimism and healthy-mindedness of liberal Protestant circles today makes mortification for mortification's sake repugnant to us. We can no longer sympathize with cruel deities, and the notion that God can take delight in the spectacle of sufferings self-inflicted in his honor is abhorrent. In consequence of all these motives, you probably are disposed, unless some special utility can be shown in some individual's discipline, to treat the general tendency to asceticism as pathological. Yet I believe that a more careful consideration of the whole matter, distinguishing between general good intention of asceticism and the uselessness of some of the particular acts of which it may be guilty, ought to rehabilitate it in our esteem, for in its spiritual meaning asceticism stands for nothing less for the essence of the twice-born philosophy. It symbolizes, lamely enough, no doubt, but sincerely, the belief that there is an element of real wrongness in the world which is neither to be ignored nor evaded, but which must be squarely met and overcome by an appeal to the soul's heroic resources, and neutralized and cleansed away by suffering. As against this view, the ultra-optimistic form of the once-born philosophy thinks we may treat evil by the method of ignoring. Let a man who by fortunate health and circumstances escapes the suffering of any great amount of evil in his own person also close his eyes to it as it exists in the wider universe outside his private experience, and he will be quit of it altogether, and can sail through life happily on a healthy-minded basis. But we saw in our lectures on melancholy how precarious this attempt necessarily is. Moreover, it is but for the individual, and leaves the evil outside of him, unredeemed and unprovided for in his philosophy. No such attempt can be a general solution of the problem, and to minds of somber tinge, who naturally feel life as a tragic mystery, such optimism is a shallow dodge or mean evasion. It accepts in lieu of a real deliverance what is a lucky personal accident merely, a cranny to escape by. It leaves the general world unhelped and still in the clutch of Satan. The real deliverance, the twice-born folk insist, must be of universal application. Pain and wrong and death must be fairly met and overcome in higher excitement, or else their sting remains essentially unbroken. If one has ever taken the fact of the prevalence of tragic death in the world's history fairly into his mind, freezing, drowning, entombment alive, wild beasts, worse men, and hideous diseases, he can, with difficulty, it seems to me, continue his own career of worldly prosperity without suspecting that he may all the while not be really inside the game, that he may lack the great initiation. Well, this is exactly what asceticism thinks, and it voluntarily takes the initiation. Life is neither farce nor genteel comedy, it says, but something we must sit at in mourning garments, hoping its better taste will purge us of our folly. The wild and heroic are indeed such rooted parts of it, that healthy-mindedness, pure and simple, with its sentimental optimism, can hardly be regarded by any thinking man as a serious solution. Phrases of neatness, coziness, and comfort can never be an answer in the Sphinx's riddle. In these remarks, I am leaning only upon mankind's common instinct for reality, which in point of fact has always held the world to be essentially a theater for heroism. In heroism, we feel life's supreme mystery is hidden. We tolerate no one who has no capacity whatever for it in any direction. On the other hand, no matter what a man's frailties otherwise may be, if he be willing to risk death, and still more if he suffers it heroically in the service he has chosen, the fact consecrates him forever. Inferior to ourselves in this way or that way, if yet we cling to life, and he is able to fling it away like a flower, as caring nothing for it, we account him in the deepest way our born superior. Each of us in his own person feels that a high-hearted indifference to life would expiate all his shortcomings. The metaphysical mystery thus recognized by our common sense, that he who feeds on death, that feeds on men, possesses life supereminently and excellently, and meets best the secret demands of the universe, is the truth of which asceticism has been the faithful champion. The folly of the cross, so inexplicable by the intellect, has yet its indestructible vital meaning. Representatively, then, and symbolically, and apart from the vagaries into which the unenlightened intellect of former times may have let it wander, asceticism must, I believe, be acknowledged to go with the profounder way of handling the gift of existence. Naturalistic optimism is mere syllabub and flattery and sponge cake in comparison. The practical course of action for us as religious men would therefore, it seems to me, not be simply to turn our backs upon the ascetic impulse, as most of us today turn them, but rather to discover some outlet for it, of which the fruits in the way of privation and hardship might be objectively useful. The older monastic asceticism occupied itself with pathetic futilities, are determined in the mere egotism of the individual, increasing his own perfection. The vanities of all others may die out, but the vanity of a saint, as regards his sainthood, is hard indeed to wear away. Ramakrishna, His Life and Sayings, 1899, page 172. But is it not possible for us to discard most of these older forms of mortification, and yet find saner channels for the heroism which inspired them? Does not, for example, the worship of material luxury and wealth, which constitutes so large a portion of the spirit of our age, make somewhat for the effeminacy and unmanliness? Is it not the exclusively sympathetic and fastidious way in which most children are brought up today, so different from the education of 100 years ago, especially in evangelical circles, in danger, in spite of its many advantages, of developing a certain trashiness of fiber? Are there not hereabouts some points of application for a renovated and revised ascetic discipline? Many of you would recognize such dangers, but would point to athletics, militarism, and individual and national enterprise and adventure as the remedies. These contemporary ideals are quite as remarkable for the energy with which they make for heroic standards of life as contemporary religion is remarkable for the way in which it neglects them. When a church has to be run by oysters, ice cream, and fun, I read in an American religious paper, you may be sure that it is running away from Christ. If one may judge by appearances, it is the present plight of many of our churches. War and adventure assuredly keep all who engage in them from treating themselves too tenderly. They demand such incredible efforts, depth beyond depth of exertion, both in degree and in duration, that the whole scale of motivation alters. Discomfort and annoyance, hunger and wet, pain and cold, squalor and filth, cease to have any deterrent operation whatever. Death turns into a commonplace matter, and its usual power to check our action vanishes. With the annulling of these customary inhibitions, ranges of new energy are set free, and life seems to cast upon a higher plane of power. The beauty of war in this respect is that it is so congruous with ordinary human nature, ancestral evolution has made us all potential warriors, so that the most insignificant individual, when thrown into an army in the field, is weaned from whatever excess of tenderness towards his precious person he may bring with him, and they easily develop into a monster of insensibility. But when we compare the military type of self-severity with that of the ascetic saint, we find a worldwide difference in all their spiritual concomitants. Live and let live, writes a clear-headed Austrian officer, is no device for an army. Contempt for one's own comrades, for the troops of the enemy, and above all, fierce contempt for one's own person, are what war demands of everyone. Far better is it for an army to be too savage, too cruel, too barbarous, than to possess too much sentimentality and human reasonableness. Well, reasonableness can kind of direct that contempt or reduce it in places, right? If the soldier is to be good for anything as a soldier, he must be exactly the opposite of a reasoning and thinking man. The measure of goodness in him is his possible use in war. War and even peace require of the soldier absolute peculiar standards of morality. The recruit brings with him common moral notions of which he must seek immediately to get rid. For him, victory, success, must be everything. The most barbaric tendencies in men come to life again in war, and for war's uses they are incommensurably good. These words are, of course, literally true. The immediate aim of the soldier's life is, as Moltke said, destruction, and nothing but destruction, and whatever constructions wars result in are remote and non-military. Consequently, the soldier cannot train himself to be too feelingless to all those unusual sympathies and respects, whether for persons or for things, that make for conservation. Yet the fact remains that war is a school of strenuous life and heroism, and being in the line of aboriginal instinct, is the only school that as yet is universally available. But when we gravely ask ourselves whether this wholesale organization of irrationality and crime be our only bulwark against effeminacy, we stand aghast at the thought, and think more kindly of ascetic religion. One hears of the mechanical equivalent of heat. What we now need to discover in the social realm is the moral equivalent of war, something heroic that will speak to men as universally as war does, and yet will be as compatible with their spiritual selves as war has proved itself to be incompatible. I have often thought that in the old monkish poverty worship, in spite of the pedantry which infested it, there might be something like that moral equivalent of war which we are asking. May not voluntarily accepted poverty be the strenuous life, without need of crushing weaker peoples? Poverty, indeed, is the strenuous life, without brass bands or uniforms, or hysteric popular applause or lies, or circumlocutions. And when one sees the way in which wealth-getting enters as an ideal into the very bone and marrow of our generation, one wonders whether a revival of the belief that poverty is a worthy religious vocation may not be the transformation of military courage and the spiritual reform which our time stands most in need of. And the quote that, when does it start? Live and let live, and to incommensurably good. CVBK, Friedens und Kriegsmoral der hier, quoted by Hamann, Psychologie du Militaire Professional, 1895. And of course, I would very strongly argue that sometimes the military can be the most ethical of groups, you know. It all depends on whether you're fighting in the cause of God or whether you're fighting for your country and doing whatever your country wants, or whatever. Well, it depends on what your country wants, right? What rules, what limits has it set for? Then you can say, okay, well, then the soldiers are gonna, you know. So you should probably consider that. You should probably figure out some of the, you know, the ethics of what is considered to be just war according to the laws of your country before you join into that sort of thing. Because I mean no insult when I say that I don't believe that either side is right in most wars. Among us English well, I mean, well, they're both wrong, but they're both right in ways, right? Among us English-speaking peoples, especially, do the praises of poverty need once more to be boldly sung. We have grown literally afraid to be poor. We despise anyone who elects to be poor in order to simplify and save his inner life. If he does not join the general scramble and pant with the money-making street, we deem him spiritless and lacking in ambition. We have lost the power of even imagining what the ancient idealization of poverty could have meant. The liberation from material attachments, the unbribed soul, the manlier indifference, the paying our way by what we are due, and not by what we have, the right to fling away our life at any moment irresponsibly, the more athletic trim, in short, the moral fighting shape. When we of the so-called better classes are scared as men, we're never scared in history at material ugliness and hardship. When we put off marriage until our house can be artistic and quake at the thought of having a child without a bank account and doomed to manual labor, it is time for thinking men to protest against so unmanly and irreligious a state of opinion. Now, see, it's irreligion that's done this to society rather than freeing it like we thought. It's like, oh well, we can break free from paying 10% to the church and pay an extra 20% of your one's income to taxes, right? On top of what you used to pay. It is true that so far as wealth gives time for ideal ends and exercise to ideal energies, wealth is better than poverty and ought to be chosen. But wealth does this in only a portion of the actual cases. Elsewhere, the desire to gain wealth and the fear to lose it are our chief breeders of cowardice and propagators of corruption. There are thousands of conjectures in which a wealth-bound man must be a slave, whilst the man for whom poverty has no terrors becomes a free man. Think of the strength which personal indifference to poverty would give us if we were devoted to unpopular causes. We need no longer hold our tongues, our fear to vote the revolutionary, our reformatory ticket. Our stocks might fall, our hopes of promotion vanish, our salaries stop, our club doors close in our faces, yet, while we lived, we would imperturbably bear witness to the spirit, and the example would help to set free our generation. The cause would need its funds, but we, its servants, would be potent in proportion as we personally were contented with our poverty. I recommend this matter to your serious pondering, for it is certain that the prevalent fear of poverty among the educated classes is the worst moral disease from which our civilization suffers. I have now said all that I can usefully say about the several fruits of religion as they are manifested in saintly lives, so I will make a brief review and pass to my more general conclusions. By brief review, he means another 10 pages and another half an hour of program, right? Our question, you will remember, is as to whether religion stands approved by its fruits, as these are exhibited in the saintly type of character. Single attributes of saintliness may, it is true, be temperamental endowments found in non-religious individuals, but the whole group of them forms a combination which, as such, is religious, for it seems to flow from the sense of the divine as from its psychological center. Whoever possesses strongly this sense comes naturally to think that the smallest details of this world derive infinite significance from the relation to an unseen divine order. The thought of this order yields him to a superior denomination of happiness and a steadfastness of soul with which no other can compare. In social relations, his serviceability is exemplary. He abounds in impulses to help. His help is inward as well as outward, for his sympathy reaches souls as well as bodies and kindles unsuspected faculties therein. Instead of placing happiness where common men place it, in comfort he places it in a higher kind of excitement, which converts discomforts into sources of cheer and annuls unhappiness. So he turns his back upon no duty, however thankless, and when we are in need of assistance, we can count upon the saint lending his hand with more certainty than we can count upon any other person. Finally, his humble-mindedness and his ascetic tendencies save him from petty personal pretensions, which so obstruct our ordinary social intercourse, and his purity gives us in him a clean man for a companion. Felicity, purity, charity, patience, self-severity. These are splendid excellencies, and the saint of all men shows them in the completest possible measure. But as we saw, all these things together do not make saints infallible. When their intellectual outlook is narrow, they fall into all sorts of holy excesses, fanaticism, or theopathic absorption, self-torment, prudery, scrupulosity, gullibility, and morbid inability to meet the world. Well, infallible. Well, if a person is fallible, they can still be not falling into those things, but there's a capability of it, right? One day a saint, another day not a saint, right? By the very intensity of his fidelity to the paltry ideals with which an inferior intellect may inspire him, a saint can be even more objectionable and damnable than a superficial carnal man would be in the same situation. We must judge him not sentimentally only, and not in isolation, but using our own intellectual standards, placing him in his environment, and esteeming his total function. Now, in the matter of intellectual standards, we must bear in mind that it is unfair, where we find narrowness of mind, always to impute it as a vice to the individual, for in religious and theological matters he probably absorbs his narrowness from his generation. Moreover, we must not confound the essentials of saintliness, which are those of general passions, of which I have spoken, with its accidents, which are the special determinations of these passions at any historical moment. In these determinations, the saints will usually be loyal to the temporary ideals of their tribe. Taking refuge in monasteries was as much an idol of the tribe in the Middle Ages as bearing a hand in the world's work is today. St. Francis or St. Bernard, were they living today, would undoubtedly be leading consecrated lives of some sort, but quite as undoubtedly they would not lead them in retirement. Our animosity to special historic manifestations must not lead us to give way the saintly impulses in their essential nature to the tender mercies of to the tender mercies of inimical critics. The most inimical critic of the saintly impulses whom I know is Nietzsche. He contrasts them with the worldly passions, as we find these embodied in the predacious military character, altogether to the advantage of the latter. Your born saint, it must be confessed, has something about him which often makes the gorge of a carnal man rise. So it will be worthwhile to consider the contrast in question more fully. Dislike of the saintly nature seems to be a negative result of the biologically useful instinct of welcoming leadership and glorifying the chief of the tribe. The chief is the potential, if not the actual tyrant, the masterful, overpowering man of prey. We confess our inferiority and grovel before him. We quail under his glance and are at the same time proud of owning so dangerous a lord. Such instinctive and submissive hero worship must have been indispensable in primeval tribal life. In the endless wars of those times, leaders were absolutely needed for the tribe's survival. If there were any tribes who owned no leaders, they can have left no issue to narrate their doom. The leaders always had good consciences, for conscience in them coalesced with will, and those who looked on their face were as much smitten with wonder at their freedom from inner restraint as with awe at the energy of their outward performances. Compared with these beaked and taloned graspers of the world, saints are herbivorous animals, tame and harmless, barnyard poultry. There are saints whose beard you may, if you ever care to, pull with impunity. Well, you shouldn't, though. Lay off my beard. Such a man excites no thrills of wonder, veiled in terror. His conscience is full of scruples and returns. He stuns us neither by his inward freedom nor his outward power, and unless he found within us an altogether different faculty of admiration to appeal to, we should pass him by with contempt. In point of fact, he does appeal to a different faculty. Reenacted in human nature is the fable of the wind, the sun, and the traveler. The sexes embody the discrepancy. The woman loves the man the more admiringly, the stormier he shows himself, and the world defies its rulers the more for being willful and unaccountable. But the woman, in turn, subjugates the man by the mystery of gentleness and beauty, and the saint has always charmed the world by something similar. Mankind is susceptible and suggestible in opposite directions, and the rivalry of influences is unsleeping. The saintly and the worldly ideal pursue their feud in literature as much as in real life. For Nietzsche, the saint represents little but sneakiness and slavishness. He is the sophisticated invalid, the degenerate par excellence, the man of insufficient vitality. His prevalence would put the human type in danger. The sick are the greatest danger for the well. The weaker, not the stronger, are the strong's undoing. It is not fear of our fellow man which we should wish to see diminished, for fear rouses those who are strong to become terrible in turn themselves, and preserves the hard-earned and successful type of humanity. What is to be dreaded by us more than any other doom is not fear, but rather the great disgust. Not fear, but rather the great pity, disgust and pity for our human fellows. The morbid are our greatest peril, not the bad men, not the predatory beings, those born wrong, the miscarried, the broken. They it is, the weakest, who are undermining the vitality of the race, poisoning our trust in life, and putting humanity in question. Every look of them is a sigh. Would I were something other. I am sick and tired of what I am. In this swamp soil of self-contempt, every poisonous weed flourishes, and all so small, so secret, so dishonest, and so sweetly rotten. Here swarm the worms of sensitiveness and resentment. Here the air smells odious with secrecy, with what is not to be acknowledged. Here is woven endlessly the net of the meanest of conspiracies, the conspiracy of those who suffer against those who succeed and are victorious. Here the very aspect of the victorious is hated, as if health, success, strength, pride, and a sense of power were in themselves things vicious, for which one ought eventually to make bitter expiation. Oh, how these people would themselves like to inflict the expiation, how they thirst to be the hangmen, and all the while their duplicity never confesses their hatred to be hatred. Zur genealogie de moral Dritte Abhandlung 14. I have abridged and in one place transposed the sentence. Poor Nietzsche's antipathy is itself sickly enough, but we all know what he means, and he expresses well the clash between the two ideals. The carnivorous-minded, strong man, the adult male and cannibal, can see nothing but moldiness and morbidness in the saint's gentleness and self-severity, and regards him with pure loathing. The whole feud revolves essentially upon two pivots. Shall the seen world or the unseen world be our chief sphere of adaptation? And must our means of adaptation in this seen world be aggressiveness or non-resistance? The debate is serious. In some sense, and to some degree, both worlds must be acknowledged and taken account of, and in the seen world both aggressiveness and non-resistance are needful. It is a question of emphasis, more or less. Well, yeah, we're constantly faced with extremisms of, one or the other, right? Is the saint's type, or the strong man's type, the more ideal? It is the saint's type, or the strong man's type, the more ideal. It has often been supposed, and even now I think it is supposed by most persons, that there can be one intrinsically ideal type of human character. A certain type of man, it is imagined, must be the best man absolutely, and apart from the utility of his function, apart from economical considerations, the saint's type and the knight's or gentleman's type have always been rival claimants of this absolute ideality, and in the ideal of military religious orders, both types were in a manner blended. According to the empirical philosophy, however, all ideals are matters of relation. It would be absurd, for example, to ask for a definition of the ideal horse, so long as dragging drays and running races, bearing children, and jogging about with tradesmen's packages all remain as indispensable differentiations of equine function. You may take what you call a general all-around animal as a compromise, but he will be inferior to any horse of a more specialized type. In some one particular direction, we must not forget this now, when in discussing saintliness, we ask if it be an ideal type of manhood, we must test it by its economical relations. I think that the method which Mr. Spencer uses in his Data of Ethics will help to fix our opinion. Ideality in its conduct is altogether a matter of adaptation. A society where all were invariably aggressive would destroy itself by inner friction, and in a society where some are aggressive, others must be non-resistant if there is to be any kind of order. This is the present constitution of society, and the mixture we owe many of our blessings, but the aggressive members of society are always tending to become bullies, robbers, and swindlers, and no one believes that such a state of things as we now live in is the millennium. It is, meanwhile, quite possible to conceive an imaginary society in which there should be no aggressiveness, but only sympathy and fairness. Any small community of true friends now realizes such a society. Abstractly considered, such a society on a large scale would be the millennium, for every good thing might be realized there with no expense of friction. To such a millennial society, the saint would be entirely adapted. His peaceful modes of appeal would be efficacious over his companions, and there would be no one extant to take advantage of his non-resistance. The saint is therefore abstractly a higher type of man than the strong man, because he is adapted to the highest society conceivable, whether that society ever be concretely possible or not. The strong man would immediately tend, by his presence, to make that society deteriorate. It would become inferior in everything save in a certain kind of bellicose excitement, dear to men as they now are. But a kind of bellicose excitement, dear to men as they now are. But if we turn from the abstract question to the actual situation, we find that the individual saint may be well or ill adapted according to particular circumstances. There is, in short, no absoluteness in the excellence of sainthood. It must be confessed that as far as this world goes, any one who makes an out-and-out saint of himself does so at his peril. If he is not a large enough man, he may appear more insignificant and contemptible for all his saintship than if he had remained a worldling. We all know daft saints, and they inspire a queer kind of aversion, but in comparing saints with strong men, we must choose individuals on the same intellectual level. The underwitted strong man, homologous in his sphere with the underwitted saint, is the bully of the slums, the hooligan or rowdy. Surely on this level is also the saint preserves a certain superiority. Accordingly, religion has seldom been so radically taken in our Western world that the devotee could not mix it with some worldly temper. It has always found good men who could follow most of its impulses, but who stopped short when it came to non-resistance. Christ himself was fierce upon occasion. Cromwell's, Stonewall Jackson's, Gordon's show that Christians can be strong men also. How is success to be absolutely measured when there are so many environments and so many ways of looking at the adaptation? It cannot be measured absolutely. The verdict will vary according to the point of view adopted. From the biological point of view, St. Paul was a failure because he was beheaded. Yet he was magnificently adapted to the larger environment of history, and so far as any saint's example is a leaven of righteousness in the world, it draws it in the direction of more prevalent habits of saintliness, because he is a success no matter what his immediate bad fortune may be. Now, people say, well, Paul, biologically, because he discouraged marriage, and in marriage that he discouraged copulation in marriage, or even, physical contact, and he gave up on getting married, so that, and thus encouraging all that, that's why biologically he considered a failure. Being killed or not, a lot of people wouldn't consider that. The greatest saints, the spiritual heroes whom everyone acknowledges, the Francises, the Bernards, Luthers, Loyolas, Wesleys, Channings, Moody's, Grattrys, the Phillips, the Brookses, the Agnes Joneses, the Margaret Halahans, and Dora Pattisons are successes from the outset. They show themselves, and there's no question everyone perceives their strength and stature. Their sense of mystery in things, their passion, their goodness irradiate about them and enlarge their outlines while they soften them. They are like pictures with an atmosphere and background, and placed alongside of them, the strong men of this world, and no other seem as dry as sticks, as hard and crude as blocks of stone, are brickbats. In a general way, then, on the whole, our abandonment of theological criteria and our testing of religion by practical common sense and the empirical method leave it in a possession of its towering place in history. See page 327. Economically, the saintly group of qualities is indispensable to the world's welfare. The great saints are immediately successes, the smaller ones are at least heralds and harbingers, and they may be leavens also of a better mundane order. Let us be saints then if we can, whether or not we succeed visibly and temporally, but in our Father's house are many mansions, and each of us must discover for himself the kind of religion and the amount of saintship which best comports with what he believes to be his powers and feels to be his truest mission and vocation. Well, our truest mission would probably be the more general one that we share with everybody, but our specifics, right? There are no successes to be guaranteed and no set orders to be given to individuals so long as we follow the methods of empirical philosophy. This is my conclusion so far. I know that on some of your minds it leaves a feeling of wonder that such a method should have been applied to such a subject, and this in spite of all those remarks about empiricism I made at the beginning of Lecture 13, page 327 to 334. How, you say, can religion, which believes in two worlds and an invisible order, be esteemed by the adaptation of its fruits to this world's order alone? It is its truth, not its utility, you insist upon, which our verdict ought to depend. If religion is true, its fruits are good fruits, even though in this world they should prove uniformly ill-adapted and full of naught but pathos. It goes back, then, after all, to the question of the truth of theology. The plot inevitably thickens upon us. We cannot escape theoretical considerations. I propose, then, that to some degree we face the responsibility. Religious persons have often, though not uniformly, professed to see truth in a special manner. That manner is known as mysticism. I will consequently now proceed to treat at some length of mystical phenomena, and after that, though more briefly, I will consider religious philosophy. And of course, the mysticism, you could say, well, the literal truth doesn't have to conflict, and essentially it doesn't if we're talking religion, with the semantic truth, with the lexiconographic truth, the experiential truth, you could say, the semantic truth. Yeah, there are particular material and psychological, cultural differences. I mean, I don't see why people deny that part. But yeah, but of course, one of the things that happens as this, as we move on from this, is this idea that like everything is equally true or equally good or something, or well, it's good for you. It's like, well, for the most part, no. A little bit sometimes, because, as we said, we had different jobs and all that. The executioner obviously has a different law that he has to follow than the rest of us.